Did you know that every time you upload a document in SharePoint Online, at least 4 other Azure services get involved behind the scenes? The real action isn't just in your document library, the invisible Cogs make or break performance. Curious what's pulling the strings? Let's unpack how Azure AD, Blob Storage, content databases, and more coordinate in real time, and why understanding these links can save you from the next big outage. The ripple effect, one click, a dozen moving parts. If you've ever stared at the creating site spinner and wondered what's actually happening, you're not alone. On paper, rolling out a SharePoint site looks easy, hit a button, grab a coffee. But in the time it takes that progress bar to inch forward, SharePoint is already juggling more background processes than most admins ever see. The user just wants a site. The tenant, however, launches a backstage performance where Azure AD, multiple content databases, policy engines, and more need to chat, sync up, and agree before the curtain opens. Microsoft likes to keep the top layer neat. Choose a template, name your site, click Create. It all feels a bit like ordering fast food from a touch screen. Tap, pay, wait. But in reality, it's the grilled cheese sandwich scenario. Simple on the outside, but stacked with every possible topping once you lift the bun. The moment you hit that Create Site button, Azure Active Directory kicks into gear. It's like the bouncer at the door, checking whether you actually belong in the VIP section. Before anything else happens, AD validates who you are, pulls your licenses, and checks against your organization's policies. Then comes the conversation with the policy engine. Modern SharePoint sites can carry a laundry list of policies, retention, compliance, sensitivity, you name it. Every time you ask for a new site, the policy service cross-references your request with whatever global or granular rules live in your tenant. Just imagine a big meeting where every department head has a veto. If an information barrier or a compliance hold is in question, site provisioning stalls until these rules have been resolved. As this negotiation unfolds, the content database steps in to find a slot for your new site collection. Content databases don't stretch infinitely. They have quotas for a reason, and they're split up by region, storage capacity, and tenant needs. Sometimes the system can't find a spot right away, especially if other teams or regions are also rushing to spin up new sites. That's when you feel the crawl. If the database in your region has just hit its storage quota, you're waiting while SharePoint tries to find another home or shuffle resources behind the scenes. Microsoft's streamlined documentation never spells out that these content database negotiations can mean the difference between an instant site and a 3-minute timeout. Add in templates and provisioning scripts, and the process gets even hairier. Each template is a bundle of pages, lists, default folders, web parts, and settings that must be set up perfectly. One small change, a missing feature enablement, a new policy rule, even an out-of-date template reference can throw that whole setup into limbo. If you're using a custom template, it has to play nice with SharePoint's ever-changing API, check with the policy engine, and still fit the latest licensing model. Suddenly, something as minor as a new web part in your template quietly adds seconds, maybe minutes, to your site's spin-up time. It only takes a minor snag in one of these steps for the whole process to stall. Picture airport security at 8 a.m. You have your boarding pass. You got there early. But some guy 2 people ahead picked today to forget his laptop and hold up the whole line. It doesn't matter that you're ready. Until that slowest checkpoint clears, nobody goes anywhere. With SharePoint Online, a snag with storage or a heated negotiation with the policy service can cause every subsequent request to bottleneck. So when your progress bar barely budges, it isn't laziness, it's SharePoint walking through every checkpoint, making sure the right mechanisms are lined up before letting you through. Here's where it gets interesting for larger organizations. Let's say a multinational firm finishes a company-wide reorg and suddenly needs hundreds of new SharePoint sites. Admins in Singapore, London, and Toronto all fire requests in the same hour. If the content database their region uses is at capacity or running close to quota, everyone waits, not just the users in one office. It isn't about the local hardware or even network latency. Behind the scenes, a global push for new resources puts stress on a single dependency point, and the system's safety nets do their job by slowing things down until everything's balanced again. Actual tenancy data shows this isn't rare. Microsoft's own telemetry and third-party research both point at cross-service dependencies as a leading culprit for slow SharePoint site creation. Multiple services, Azure AD, policy engines, content databases, and even OneDrive hooks have to handshake before the new site is ready. Just one delay sets off a domino effect. That's why, for admins and end users, it can feel like every new site request touches half of Azure, with one transaction lighting up a tree of dependencies nobody can see from a browser window. So the next time you tap Create Site and see that sluggish progress bar, odds are it's not SharePoint slacking off. It's a little handshake with identity, a quick debate over policy, a search for open space, and a negotiation with every dependency that lives behind your tenant. Each layer puts in a vote, all in the name of security, compliance, and keeping everything neatly in sync. You don't just get a new site, you get a signed and sealed package that checks off hundreds of requirements before it lands in your app launcher. But the show doesn't end the moment your new site appears. Site provisioning is just the first handshake. Once your site is live, the real web of behind-the-scenes connections gets even more complicated, especially once users start uploading documents and searching for content, because that's when SharePoint's invisible gears really start grinding. Invisible dependencies. Why search and permissions collide? If you've ever watched a document stubbornly refuse to appear in SharePoint search, or gotten the flood of access denied calls from users who could open files just yesterday, you know this isn't just a fluke. Modern SharePoint promises search that just works, and permissions so granular you can lock down a single file. But the reality sits somewhere between the marketing and daily admin headaches. So why does a straightforward upload sometimes turn into a support ticket fiesta? Let's break this down. At the heart of SharePoint's promise is that users should find what they need quickly, and only if they're supposed to see it. Behind that promise sits a cluster of services. SharePoint's own search crawlers, its distributed indexers, and the ever-present Azure Active Directory, which acts as the middleman for identity and access. When you upload a document, SharePoint pushes it through a pipeline that doesn't just store your file. Instead, it triggers the search crawler to scan its contents and its metadata, and then asks Azure AD to double-check who's allowed to see it. If everything lines up, the document lands in both the library and the search index. At least that's the theory. In practice, a tiny change, say an admin moving a library from one site to another or flipping on versioning for a busy list, sets off a much bigger series of downstream effects. Take versioning as an example. The second you enable it for a well-used list, every document edit or check-in creates a new version. Each version needs to be indexed. Now, every single edit triggers extra work for both the database and search service, which can bog down the indexing queue and put your search results hours behind real-time changes. If you've got a few power users hammering away on an important project folder, your crawler might be teeing up hundreds, sometimes thousands of indexing events in the background. This isn't just theoretical. In busy tenants, you can see popular file libraries fall out of sync with search for days, all because a simple setting increased the background traffic by an order of magnitude. The story gets even messier when you adjust permissions. Let's say you need to lock down a sensitive folder because of a leadership shuffle. You update the group access and expect the change to ripple out immediately. Instead, users come knocking the next morning. Half their files are MIA from search, or worse, still appear but throw an error when clicked. Here's why. Every time a permission changes at folder, item, or site level, SharePoint has to update not just the direct access list, but also how everything is represented in the search schema. Search crawlers don't just care about what's in a document, they also have to check who can see it before it ever appears in anyone's results. So a single permission tweak launches a site-wide recalibration, and this recalibration isn't a quick sweep. It's more like adding a surprise stop to a major train line. Maybe you only wanted to add an extra stop at one station, but now every other train behind it needs to adjust. Search crawling and index updating gets held up in the queue, and each bottleneck can push the backlog further. The knock-on effect is real. Admins report users suddenly lose access to files that should be visible, or find sensitive docs in search results days before the new permissions finally kick in. Microsoft has quietly acknowledged this lag. Their own engineers have explained that for large tenants or major library reorganizations, it's not unusual for indexing or permissions updates to take hours, sometimes weeks, to fully propagate. And there's no big warning banner in SharePoint telling you this. Instead, you get that classic admin scenario. The platform looks steady, but behind the scenes, the search index is still chewing through old updates one chunk at a time. It's why Migrations or bulk permission changes are the number one root cause for all those "it worked yesterday" help desk calls. You make a change on Friday, but users spot the fallout a week later. Now, here's the twist that trips up even experienced admins. Search crawlers behave like that overzealous security guard who checks, rechecks, and triple checks access before letting anyone in. When a permission tangle crops up, say two conflicting group memberships or a problem with inheritance, it isn't just the one document that vanishes from search. The crawler might block access to whole folders or even the entire site collection in search results simply because it can't guarantee every user's permission set is current. That's why one minor tweak can turn into nothing is searchable with zero warnings. So what do you take from all this? The pain often isn't a technical bug, but the system catching up to a domino effect you started days earlier. Migrating a team's files, rolling out a new template, or just trying to get more granular with permissions can create unseen traffic jams across several services. Knowing that you can predict slowdowns or visibility hiccups before they become major problems. It's not just about tech, it's about understanding how each background service plugs into the next. Next time someone complains search is slow or their library looks empty, remember, you're really watching a parade of updates working their way through a web of invisible checkpoints. And most of the time, that curtain call started with a single change that looked harmless on the surface. There's another layer, though, that takes these invisible delays global, how the physical movement of files and the catch me if you can dance of CDNs and blob storage can add speed bumps in places you least expect. Global speed bumps, content delivery, blob storage, and the CDN maze. If you've worked out of one office and then tried something as simple as viewing the same SharePoint page from another, you've probably seen it. Images and documents that appear instantly for one group, but crawl for another. Maybe you just migrated to modern blob storage, expecting things to get faster all around, only for certain teams to report that their stuff loads like it's coming from a filing cabinet in another country. That's because SharePoint's speed isn't all about how fast your content database can cough up files. It's a balancing act between where those files live, how efficiently they're cached, and the invisible paths your data travels along different networks. Let's take a closer look at what that really means. Modern SharePoint is built to shift file storage away from older monolithic content databases to something called blob storage. In theory, this gives you more scalability and better performance, especially for large files and high traffic sites. But where your files actually live physically and logically plays a huge role in how quickly users get them. When you upload a document or an image, SharePoint doesn't necessarily serve it right from the city you're sitting in. Instead, it might hand it off to a storage account in a different Azure region. That's why users in North America might get snappy load times, while colleagues in Singapore see the progress bar slow dance its way across the screen. This is where content delivery networks, CDNs, show up on the scene. CDNs are supposed to work like a smart postal system, putting copies of your frequently accessed files closer to users in different regions. If an employee in London opens an image, the idea is that a London-based CDN edge serves it. On paper, this cuts down on waiting, saves bandwidth, and smooths over the physical distance. But in practice, this setup only works if two things go right. The CDN cache actually has the file you need, and the blob storage path is mapped correctly. The nightmare scenario for performance is when a user requests a file, the CDN cache is empty or expired, and SharePoint needs to make a fresh trip back to the origin blob storage, possibly across oceans, several subnets, and Azure's backbone. Suddenly, a simple PNG image loads with a delay long enough for users to notice and start filing support tickets. And it's almost never clear to the end user what caused it. All they see is a site that feels worse than the old local server. After a migration, this is where things get especially weird. There are plenty of stories about companies that made the leap from on-prem to SharePoint Online, rolled out modern storage, and then got blindsided. One global company, for example, ran classic SharePoint pages loaded with embedded images and found that users in their Asia offices faced brutal load times for graphics, even though everything was supposedly in the cloud. Dig in, and it turns out those images landed in a blob storage account on the other side of the world. The CDN, meanwhile, was either misconfigured or not caching long enough, forcing every request back across thousands of miles. Blob storage integration definitely gives SharePoint new flexibility, but it also introduces new places for things to bottleneck. For a while, all the performance problems pointed at content databases or bad local hardware. Now, you have to factor in whether cache headers are set up right in your CDN profile, file, if objects are being cached close to end users, or if a site template change just triggered a mass cache invalidation. Something as light touch as tweaking a site template or enabling a new SharePoint feature can cause a background refresh for dozens of CDN endpoints around the world. Next thing you know, everyone gets a fresh trip back to the original storage, fast in one office, glacial in another. And the numbers support what admins feel on the ground. Research across a handful of multinational firms found that nearly a third of SharePoint Online performance gripes boiled down to CDN config issues. A big share of tickets wasn't about major outages or missing data. It was that simple requests like loading a background image or a logo for a banner became multi-second delays simply because the CDN cache wasn't lined up with the new reality of blob-based storage. Sometimes it's a policy that keeps CDN files fresh for too short or too long. Other times, the Edge server maintenance schedule means whole groups of users are forced to wait while cache warm-up happens again and again. There's also a pattern admins run into without warning. As they tune site templates, activate new web parts, or roll out compliance updates, few realize that these tweaks can force cache invalidations, sometimes globally. You might think you're just giving everyone a slick new homepage, but suddenly image requests route the long way around, and troubleshooting turns into a game of network whack-a-mole. It's the unexpected domino effect. One config change, and now users in remote locations are back to old-school load times. So understanding the interplay between CDN, blob storage, and all the layers SharePoint Online sits on top of isn't just for the architects anymore. Awareness of this chain reaction gives you an early warning when file delivery will become a problem, and clues about which settings to leave alone if you want your users to stay happy in every region. Want to keep your SharePoint humming? It comes down to knowing what will ripple and what will just work. That leaves us with the big question: how do you avoid these runaway domino effects and keep SharePoint from turning one simple change into a week of slowdowns across half your organization? If SharePoint feels off, it's rarely a one-service glitch. Most slowdowns are a chain reaction, search crawlers catching up, content databases juggling space, or a CDN cache not playing along. But before flipping another toggle or starting that migration, it's worth thinking about which parts of the engine room you're nudging. A single tweak might set off a domino effect, even if it seems minor on the surface. That's why considering the broader system isn't just for solution architects, it's for everyone trying to avoid trouble tickets. If you're curious how these layers stack up, there's always plenty more to unpack.